Last week, Transparency International Zambia issued a report. This was in relation to political party financing, but also issues raised in the Kawambwa parliamentary by-election, where they accused the ruling UPND of vote buying. This has raised questions among stakeholders, but also a worry for citizens, especially now that by-elections are still ongoing, with some in a few weeks. Questions arise on whether or not the Electoral Commission of Zambia is competent to handle these elections, and what next for the citizens. I asked this and many other questions to Maurice Nyambe, who is the Transparency International Zambia Executive Director. My name is Dingindaba Jonah Buyoya. Welcome to the stage. Mr. Nyambe, thank you so much for joining me on this edition of This Day. First of all, let's start off with an observation. You've made an observation about the UPND's visibility in Kawambwa, and you spoke on Article 64 of the Constitution that speaks on political party campaign financing. Let's talk about the measures that you propose to ensure that political parties disclose all campaign financing sources and expenditures transparently once legislation has been enacted.
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very important question. When I look at the issue that we're talking about, campaign financing, but even more broadly speaking, political party funding, our view has always been, and this is not only our view, but that of many other stakeholders as well, including other civil society organizations, is that the influence of money when it comes to elections specifically, but generally when it comes to the political process, I think has to be regulated. And the reason why it has to be regulated is that primarily because money has the capability and the potential to skew the playing field in favor of a particular side, in favor of a particular political party, or in favor of a particular candidate. And that is why we think that it is important, well, that's one of the reasons why we think it is important for there to be regulation in terms of even how much is spent when it comes to elections. So we think it is a very important endeavor to do, but also the reason why we think this is important to do is also primarily because this is something that we have said we would actually do as a country. And of course, I'm talking about the constitutional provision that is there in Article 60, Clause 4 of the Constitution of Zambia, which actually spells out the need, number one, for there to be some sort of legislation that regulates the funding of political parties in Zambia, broadly speaking. Of course, that also speaks about the need for such political parties, to provide books of accounts, if they are funded publicly in that manner. But also, beyond just funding of political parties themselves, it's also issues to do with campaign financing. So it's issues to do with putting a cap in terms of the maximum that a political party or an entity can spend in an election. And again, that is something that is provided by the same constitutional provision that I'm talking about. So for us, really, it's a question of just actualizing what the supreme law of the land rather says. Because for it to be in the Constitution, it means there was some thinking that was done. There was some logic that was applied to it. And I think that it doesn't augur well for us to have constitutional provisions that we are not giving effect in terms of them being actualized. And that is why we have been on this matter, and it is a matter that we'll continue to advocate on.
This article in the Constitution has been in existence for several years now. So then why do you think that it has taken so long to see its implementation?
Well, it's a very good question, actually. And I wish I had the full categorical answer, but I can give my thoughts around why I think or why we think it has taken so long. I think, first of all, when it comes to something of this nature, you're talking about, let's speak, for example, campaign financing. Campaign financing, of course, relates to elections. And you and I know that elections are a very emotive endeavor. Elections are, an endeavor that really generates a lot of interest by many different or from many different stakeholders. So it could be that there is maybe an unknown fear that exists among, in this case, maybe let me say government, for example, because government is the one that has the responsibility of taking bills to Parliament, even though, of course, there can be a private member's bill and things like that. But I think the point I'm making is that it could be that maybe there are some unfounded fears that exist. I can tell you in some of the deliberations and conversations that we have had with our members of parliament, for example, we did a study not long ago on elections, on money in elections. And one of the things that we got from the members of parliament that we talked to, we realized actually that it is not all members of parliament who are on board with this particular constitutional provision. So you have a number of members of parliament who are averse to the idea of, there being political party funding or campaign financing for political parties. So it could be that the message really has not sunk home yet. And maybe part of this actually has to be, part of the blame maybe has to be put on players such as ourselves. Maybe we have not done a very good job in terms of driving the message home as to why it is important for us to have political parties funded, and also for us to have, a cap on how much political parties can spend in terms of their finances. So it could be that you have unfounded fears from key players and key stakeholders who are, for whatever reason, are averse to the idea of there being such measures or such regulations are put in place. That could be one. The second one could be, and this is related again to what I've talked about. I think one of the pieces of feedback that we have received from, particularly from members of parliament that belong to the ruling party, the question is, why should, we as government fund opposition political parties when they are going to be doing, basically they're going to be working against us. They will use that funding, to sort of sell themselves and things like that. But I think the point that we make in relation to that is that democracy is the system of governance that we have chosen for ourselves. And this is what democracy actually entails, okay? So yes, political parties will be funded. They will go out and offer themselves as an alternative to the existing regime, because that is essentially what opposition political parties are supposed to be. So essentially, yes, they will go out and offer themselves as alternatives because that is what they're supposed to do. But the third argument, I think, that has been there when it comes to actualizing this particular constitutional provision is, of course, the argument to do with resources, because as you may recall, there was actually a political parties bill that was developed some years back, I think under the presidency of the late President Mwanawasa, and it was taken actually for assent. The president then, of course, refused to assent to that bill, and the reason that he gave was that the country did not have money to actually fund political parties. So those are the three maybe primary reasons that I would think are at the core of this delay that we have seen to put this constitutional provision into effect. But I think going back to what I said earlier, democracy is what we have decided as the system of government that we're going to follow. And democracy has got costs attached to it. And we think that these are some of the costs that we will have to pay in order for us to refine our democracy and make it work the best way possible that is supposed to work for us.
Do you think that the outcome of the Kawambwa by-election was influenced by how much funding these political parties had during campaigns?
Oh, brilliant question. And I think for us, really, that is the gist of our concern. I mean, we have not, of course, done any specific study to sort of answer that question directly and to be able to show without any doubt and categorically that the reason why we have such an outcome in this by-election is because of the amount of money that was spent. But I think it would be very difficult for one not to have that argument. Okay, it will be very difficult because we know the role that money plays when it comes to the political process and when it comes to a campaign, for example. And for us, that actually is the gist of our argument, because what we are saying is that the way things are now, in the absence of a specific legislation that regulates or that guides in terms of even how much political parties can spend, essentially you are reducing elections to a battle or a contestation of how much money a political party has or how much money a particular candidate has. And for us, we think that is an anomaly and that is wrong, because we think that the battle for political office, the battle for political positions should not really be determined who has the deepest pocket or who has the biggest wallet. It should rather be the question of who has the best message, the better message, the better development message, or whatever message it is that they are selling to the electorate. I think the risk that we have and what we have obtaining now is that it is difficult not to be categorical and say that the results of by-elections and many other electoral processes are not the result of how much people have spent. It would be interesting to do a study, I think, on that particular case. But for us, that is the gist of our concern. What regulating, the amount of money spent in an election, what that is going to do is that it is going to contribute to a leveling of the playing field, so that you do not have people that have, obscene or insane amounts of money, reducing that political contest merely to how much money one has. It should be a battle of ideas rather than a battle of who has more money.
What are some of the things we can do to ensure fairness in campaign financing to avoid monopolization of campaign spaces by wealthier political parties?
I think that is a very key aspect actually to consider, and for us that is why we are pushing the issue of regulating the role of money when it comes to processes of this nature. So I think for us the surest way really to ensure fairness, or well, maybe not the surest, but at least one of the most significant ones, is precisely what we are advocating for, that we should actually cap the amount that a candidate or a political party can spend in an election. Because if you have the same cap for everybody, then at least you you are creating a more even playing field, and you create for a more even contest, so to speak. Of course, it doesn't mean that when you put a cap, for example, you put X amount as the maximum that people can spend. There will, of course, be people who will not be able to spend even up to that level. Maybe some people will only be able to spend half of what the cap is. But then you will have people that will actually be able to get to the maximum. But I think what that will do is that it creates a sort of even playing field in that particular contest. But beyond that, I think that even as we are talking about, the need for campaign financing legislation or political, party funding legislation, I think that there are still a number of things that we can do now, even in the absence of such legislation, that can contribute, towards the leveling of the playing field. And I'll give one example. I think one of the things that one of the concerns rather that we raised in our statement last week had to do with a number of malpractices that we witnessed in Kawamba on the ground, where you had members of the ruling party actually dishing out monies to the electorate. Now, of course, that was not that was dressed rather as a government empowerment program, and we know that you have development programs that happen in across the breadth and length of this country. But I think what we have seen repeatedly, and this is not just with this regime, by the way, going back as far back as you can go, is if a by-election is happening in a particular locality, suddenly you see an acceleration of projects, an acceleration of empowerment programs and things like that. Now, in that the ruling party will have access to some of those programs and some of those projects, which access opposition political parties are not going to have. So already, if you allow that to happen within the context of a campaign, within the context of a by-election, it means that you are already skewing the playing field, because other players within that setting do not have access to those same resources. Now, we are not saying, of course, that development should stop just because there is a by-election. But for us, we don't see why a government empowerment program should be done or effected at a political rally, for example. So if the UPND, and I'm using UPND because they are the government in power, if you have the UPND having a political rally in Kawamba, for example, why should you then bring, a CDF or youth empowerment program or whatever it is, whatever other empowerment program, why should you distribute those resources at a campaign rally? Because when you distribute it at a campaign rally, it means then that you are saying you're connecting it basically to, to the campaign. And so for us, that is the concern. The concern is that, yes, whilst we are still pushing for legislation that will cap how much, political players spend in an election, there are still things that we can do now to ensure that we contribute towards the leveling of a playing field, and some of which actually have to do with the enforcement of the Electoral Code of Conduct that provides for some of these anomalies, and provides ways in which the ECZ, being the electoral management body, can actually sanction some of these players so that we can contribute to a level playing field.
You have worked again alongside, I beg your pardon, the ZCID, and this is in pushing this agenda of campaign and political party financing since 2019. And I'd like to know what sort of feedback you have received from political parties over this issue.
Well, I think the feedback generally has been positive. And by the way, just to mention that this work around pushing for legislation to do with political party funding, this is not work that we have just started in the recent past. As a matter of fact, this work predates even the UPND being in government. So when we started the conversation, which was around 2019, 2020, somewhere there, the UPND were actually in opposition. And some of the meetings that we had with political parties back then, it was during the time when the UPND were in opposition and the Patriotic Front were in power. Of course, the tables have changed now. But generally speaking, maybe just to respond specifically to your question, there has been a general, I think there is a general acceptance when it comes to the political parties themselves, okay? Because when we have been engaging with these political parties, we have actually engaged with them at the very highest level, and I'm talking about the Secretary General level, for example. So we've had a number of interventions, a number of engagements, together, of course, with the Zambia Center for Inter-Party Dialogue, which you have alluded to, where we have met the general secretaries or secretary generals of these political parties. So it is at that high level. But of course, even within the political parties themselves, I mean, political parties are not homogeneous amongst themselves, but even just within one individual political party. So even in a political party, for example, you have a divergence of views, where you have some members maybe being for the idea and others not being for the idea. So those concerns and those differences will always be there. But I think for the most part, the principle of, funding political parties as a country is something that is there, that is provided for in our constitution. And I think for the most part, certainly when I look at the upper echelons of power within these political parties, I think that is a message that has been accepted. But within those political parties and among political parties, there are still variations, even among some members of parliament, as I've alluded to earlier. So I think for us, the issue really is for us to become better at, delivering our message across as to the need and why it is important for there to be this legislation in place. And I think that is a message that we'll continue to advocate for, not just as an organization, but other organizations as well, such as, ZCID, CCMG, and many other players that are interested in this space.
Now, we know that there are some concerns that have been raised about the state funding political parties coming with risks, such as the risk of misuse of public funds, favoritism, or lack of accountability among political parties. So how can this issue be addressed?
I think that's another important issue that you raise. And to be honest with you, that risk actually will always be there. I think that is something that we just need to be very cognizant of, that, that risk is always going to be there, but it's about how that risk is managed and what, processes and provisions are going to put in place to ensure that we manage that risk. For us, there are two things that we see. First of all, when we're talking about campaign financing, for example, I think we already have a system in place that can actually see to it that the provisions to do with how and there is the Electoral Process Act, there are the electoral regulations that provide for a whole range of instances and providing even for punitive measures that should be put in place in case of a flouting of these different provisions or these different regulations. So for us, certainly when it comes to the issue of campaign financing, we think that the teeth that the law gives it, because the law has given the ECZ the teeth to be able to bite, but I don't think that we have seen the ECZ, certainly not on many occasions, we've not seen them really sanctioning political parties, for example, because for us, what we'd like to see is if there is a violation of any provision of the law. For example, when the law talks about, the Electoral Process Act talks about, distribution of monies and other gifts being an electoral offense, if then you see that happening within a by-election or any, even in a general election, we should be able to see punitive measures being taken against those culprits. And if that includes even banning the candidates or political parties from taking part in an election, I think then that's the direction that we should take. And for us, we think that it is only when we begin to see those punitive measures being effected, that is the only way that, we're going to start changing the narrative and changing the mindset and even changing how people behave and how political parties behave when it comes to elections. So when it comes to campaign financing, we think that the ECZ has got a very important role to play in terms of seeing to it that there is full adherence to the provisions of the law, the existing law, but also to the provisions of whatever law is going to speak to issues of, the maximum that political parties can spend in that sense. But secondly, maybe the second aspect of your question, when you talk about political parties maybe misusing funds, I think that is where the issue of audited accounts actually comes in, because I think the constitutional provision actually does state that there should be a way in which political parties will be able to give audited accounts, to whatever body, and I don't know what body would be put in place that will be receiving that. Is it already the Auditor General's office or things? So these are things I think that can be thought of and addressed. But I think for us, the issue is that even when the legislation is put in place, it should not just be one that gives the parameters for what political players can and cannot do. It should also give very punitive measures, very punitive provisions that will say what will happen should there be any flouting of those regulations and what punishment is going to be there. And I think that that punishment then would have to be effected where such abrogation actually takes place.
Now you tell me, have you had any engagement with the public to educate them on the importance of this issue and ensure that there's an involvement from the side of the public in the conversation around campaign financing?
Well, thank you so much. I think for us as an organization, speaking specifically for TIZ, we have really tried to go out of our way to inform the masses in terms of why this is important. And we've done this through various means. I mean, we do have a campaign that has been running on our social media platforms, for example, just talking about the role of money in politics generally. And I think this is something that we have done quite consistently. I did mention earlier that we did a study on, elections and money in Zambia, of course, focusing on the 2021 elections, and the parliamentary part of the elections, by the way, is what we focus on. And that study actually is something that we have launched and is something that is in the public domain. And so we have played our role in terms of trying to generate evidence-based research that will point to, what what happens currently in terms of the role that money plays within our political processes. So that is our contribution. The fact that, we have campaigns running on social media, we have research that we have done, and we have launched reports to be able to highlight the different observations that we have on this particular subject. And just to mention that this is something that we'll continue to do even within the context of our work, because we know that it is not maybe a message that is going to be to be picked on just immediately or just once off when you do an intervention, but it's something that will continue to to raise awareness on. But I also just needed to mention that it is not just TIZ that is working in this space or on this particular issue. I know for a fact, like you mentioned, the Zambia Center for Interparty Dialogue, which is of course comprises of political parties themselves. They've also done their own, made their own efforts in terms of being able to publicize this. But also organizations like CCMG, for example, I know that they are also on this particular subject. Chapter 1 Foundation has also got some interventions related to this. So the point I'm driving home is that as civil society, we are really doing our part through awareness raising on social media, through the one-on-one engagements that we have with different players, but also through conducting of research to try and highlight or give more information related to a particular aspect of this subject. And I think that is something that we'll continue to do so that we can actually get to a point where we see, everybody really sees the need for this law to be enacted, and hopefully then we're going to get to the end of this conversation.
How exactly does knowing the source of income for a political party contribute to the strengthening of our democracy?
Absolutely. So for us, I think maybe we can start from what I mentioned earlier on, that money, of course, does have a role to play in politics. That is, I mean, you cannot run a political party or run a campaign without money. So obviously, we know that money does have a role to play. But I think the concern and the issue that we have is that money should not be the determining factor, even when it comes to when it comes to who actually wins an election or which political party actually ends up in power. It should not be money that should be the determining factor. Now, there are a number of ways through which not having such a regulation in place actually damages, in a sense, our democracy. The first is that I mentioned earlier that democracy is a system of government that we have chosen. And in a democracy, when we're talking about elections, for example, elections are a contestation of ideas. Who has the best ideas in terms of being able to reach out to the citizenry, and who can actually demonstrate and show to the citizenry that they'll be able to to advance the development agenda or things of that nature. So basically, if you introduce money, if somebody has an obscene amount of money, for example, it means they will have more access to the airwaves, for example. They'll be able to pay for 100 programs on Diamond TV for them to be able to sell their message. And then here you have another person who does not have access to such a vast amount of resources because there is no cap. Again, remember, there's no cap on how much people can spend. So already you are creating an uneven playing field, and democracy cannot succeed where you have an uneven playing field, because then what it entails is that you've taken it from the space of it being a contest of ideas to it being a contest of who has the most money. And it is in that way that then you get democracy being affected, because then it is not really about who is able to sell themselves better, but it is about who has the most money to be able to have access to all these different ways through which people can deliver their message. But beyond that, I think another important issue really has to do with the whole issue of policy capture. Of course, it is state capture is another thing that is talked about. But for me, I would like to bring in the issue of policy capture, where you have maybe a particular entity giving a political party money, and you don't know who this entity is, okay? You don't know who this entity is, but you've got this entity giving a political party huge sums of money, contributing to their campaign and things like that. When this political party then forms government, the entity that gave them money will come to them and say, okay, we supported you, okay? That support was not for no reason. And because we supported you, this is how we would like, maybe in the agriculture sector, we want this policy to be like this, we want this policy to be like this. In the mining sector, we want this policy to be like this because we want to derive benefit from our investment and things like that. So what that does is that it makes policy formulation potentially, and I'm talking about a potential area here, it makes policy formulation potentially a function of what those particular financiers actually want versus what the vast majority of the electorate want. As the people who vote, these leaders into office, we'll just be surprised that, there are certain policy decisions and policy processes maybe that are done, which do not speak maybe to even the things that they said in the campaign, or which do not really respond to the felt needs of the citizenry, but they respond to the needs of the financier. So if you do not know who is financing, this political party, who financed this political party, even to get into office, it becomes very difficult for you to even make those connections. To say, the reason why we have this policy provision being put like this is because they want to respond to the needs of this financier as opposed to the needs of the citizenry. So it's in those ways that it becomes very difficult for us to promote and enhance democracy in the absence of openness and transparency related to who is funding these political parties. Just as I end on this, you remember that there was that issue of the ministers who stayed on in office, and there was that constitutional court ruling that actually mandated those cabinet ministers to pay back, the monies that they got for that period. To this, you know that we do not know who actually paid for those ministers. We just got a statement from the political party in power then that a well-wisher had paid for, for the ministers. And the question that we asked then is, okay, what was in it for this well-wisher? What did they get in return for paying for these ministers? So it's really just the need for us to be very open, the need for us to be very transparent, and the need for us to be democratic. And that is why we are pushing for a disclosure, even when it comes to who is funding these political parties, because then we'll be able to make better sense of some of the policy and legislative, interventions that we are seeing by our government.
What can we learn from African countries that have laws that regulate campaign and political party financing?
Well, yes, indeed. There are actually a number of countries from Africa, some actually from within our region, that have done that. I think the ones that we have certainly have had engagements with South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana. And so we can learn lessons from those. And the thing actually is that there are different experiences in terms of all those at different countries, because as you will appreciate, the context will differ from country to country. And so what we probably would do best is for us to look at these countries in particular, and even others maybe that we may not even have known about, and see what has worked for them and what has not worked. What are some of the key challenges that they have faced? And from our interactions with some of these countries, one of the things that of course has arisen is the whole element of some of the issues that you raised, for example, like how do we make sure that the monies that political parties receive are actually used for the purpose for which they are meant, even for example if it's in a campaign finance context, how do we make sure that these monies are not going to the individual pockets of candidates and things like that. So there are lessons of course that can be picked, and I know that it will be important for us to actually pick those lessons. But again, like I said, the Zambia context will be very different from the Kenya context or the Ghana context or the South Africa context. But I think the point is that we are not going to know what works for us until we actually try it out. So I think our argument is that let's put this legislation in place. It is provided for in our constitution. Let's put a legislation in place and try it out, and we'll see what lessons we'll draw from it. It could be that maybe we are not going to get it right with the first legislation that we put, and then we can see how we can then improve specific elements of it. But in the absence of actually starting, it will be very difficult for us to actually be able to determine what works well for us and what does not. So the simple answer to your question is that yes, there are countries that we can learn from. Those countries, have had a wide range of results in terms of experiences. So it's not that it's all cozy for them and everything is perfect, but there are certainly lessons that we can learn in terms of what we can do and maybe what we should not do, or the pitfalls that we should look out for when it comes to a legislation of this nature. But those lessons will only be learned when we actually put the legislation in place. So our argument is that let's put that legislation in place.
In your monitoring of the Kawambwa by-election, you developed and rolled out a web-based campaign financing monitoring tool that is there to track political parties' campaign spending in elections. How did this go, and how do you intend to use this in the future, especially that we've got an election coming up in 2026?
Well, thank you so much. So basically, this builds on from the work that we've been doing. You will recall, Justin, that this, the issue of how much money political parties are spending is not something that is very new to us as TIZ in the sense of us talking about it and us doing certain things about it. You may recall that back in 2021, we did a very small study that looked at how much political parties were spending on billboards advertising. In Lusaka. It was, of course, restricted just to Lusaka. So basically, this issue of us trying to ascertain the role that money actually plays in our political processes is something that we have been on for quite a while now. And so what we tried out in Kawambwa is really just building on some of the interventions that we have already had in the past. So basically, it is a web-based tool that really tries to ascertain where are the greatest spending points, for example, like what do candidates spend their money on mostly? And so what you get is that you get things like, transport, things like donations to churches, donations to local development projects and things like that. So basically, it's a whole range. But the idea really is that we want to use this tool as one of the ways through which we can be able to track how much political parties are spending. It is not a perfect tool. It was just introduced in this Kawambwa by-election. And the idea was for us to really see how it could work, first of all. So it did give us some information related to how much political parties were spending. And some of the things that we mentioned in our statement actually are a result of the information that we collected using that tool. So what is happening now is that the idea is that we would like to roll this tool out to the rest of the different elections that we are going to be monitoring, the elections that we are going to be involved in. So right now we are in the process of putting together the key lessons that we got from how that rollout in Kawambwa went, in order to see areas in which you can maybe refine the tool, in which to see areas in which you can make it a lot more specific in terms of the issues that we are hoping it will give us. So this is part of the wider work that we are doing, in order for us to try and contribute to the strengthening of the electoral process in Zambia, and generally speaking, the political process, and ultimately to be able to strengthen our democracy. So yes, we used that online too. It's basically just ascertaining how much political parties are spending on what specific activities within the context of a campaign. And we hope that the information that gives us will then feed into us being able to refine that too, in order for it to become a more prominent feature and a more permanent feature when it comes to not just by elections, but even general elections, as we are going to be going into next year.
In your assessment, you accused the UPND party of vote buying in Kawambwa. The UPND has since requested that you provide evidence of your accusations. Do you intend on doing so?
Of course, it wasn't even an accusation as such, because I mean, like we said, we were on the ground in Kawambwa, and our people on the ground reported what they saw. So this wasn't hearsay. As far as we are concerned, it was actually what we observed. And we did mention also in the statement, or rather in the conversation that followed the release of our statement, that we were not the only players that were on the ground in Kawamba. And we were not even the only CISO that was on the ground in Kawamba. CCMG, for example, were on the ground as well. And as a matter of fact, they did also raise a lot of concerns related to several malpractices that happened. I think some of the things that other players mentioned were that they also witnessed some opposition political parties distributing 10 kwacha notes to the electorate. So the anomalies actually were happening on a wide scale. So it wasn't just related to one political party. Apparently, it looks like it was all political parties essentially that were involved in that. But in terms of our own monitoring, in terms of what we saw ourselves, okay, our monitors on the ground actually witnessed this happening at the UPND rally. They did not witness it at another rally. That is not to say that it was not happening elsewhere, but what we were able to see ourselves is that our monitors actually were able to witness that. When you talk about us providing evidence, I mean, well, it may not be as straightforward as it is, because it's not necessarily that maybe it will click to you that you need to start taking a video of this. But what we are able to say without without regret and categorically is that our people on the ground did see money being distributed at the UPND campaign rally. And so basically we have that information, and that is information that we are ready even to, to put our head on the chopping block over. Of course, we did see what the response was from government. I need to hasten to mention that it's not a response that surprised us. But the one thing that we are not going to do is we do not want to get into this tit for tat situation with government where, they say, do this, be able to show this. What we said in the context of Kawamba, we said everything that we said in the report that we did on Kawamba, and we are able to stand by that report. There's nothing that we are withdrawing in terms of even what we said, because we said what we saw on the ground, and so that stands. So there's really nothing new that we are going to say on Kawamba, because everything that we needed to say, we said it in our report, and we're very open for anybody, whether it's the UPND as a party or government or whoever. We're very open for us to have this even this one-on-one engagement with them if they want, in the context of a proper process that we're going to sit down and we say, okay, this is what we discovered, and it's based on this information, it's based on ABC. We're very open and willing to do that. But what we will not do is that we'll not get into this public boxing match, so to speak, where the minister says this, we also say this. We're absolutely not going to do that, because everything that we have to say about Kawamba, we said it in our statement. And if they want to have more engagement on this, we are very open for them. I mean, our doors are very open for them to come, and we'll be able to show them what we based our report on. So I think for us, that is the entirety of what we're going to say when it comes to the Kawamba issue.
On another issue, should we expect the launch of the 2024 Corruption Perception Index report and the launch of the Zambia Bribe Payers Index survey report to be done in the first quarter of 2025?
Yes, absolutely. I can confirm categorically that both reports actually will be launched within this first quarter. For the Corruption Perception Index, the launch date is 11th of February. And as you may know, this is actually a global launch. So it is being launched globally on the 11th of February. But of course, individual countries then will be able to, determine what sort of a launch event they are going to do. So we as Zambia, as a TI Zambia, we're going to be doing this through a breakfast launch, the details of which, of course, are going to be made available to the different institutions and media houses that we are going to invite. So basically, the CPI 2024 launch is on the 11th of February. And then as the ZBPI launch, as you know, we do the ZBPI together with the Anti-Corruption Commission. And And so we are actually in conversations with them in terms of a specific date that will work for the both of us. But we know for a fact that that is going to happen sometime in early March. Well, towards the end of February or early March is when the ZBPI launch is going to happen. So we are on course, and I can state that both reports are going to be launched within the first quarter of this year, and we are very much looking forward to that.
Maurice Nyambe, thank you so much for talking to me on this edition of This Day.
Thank you for having me, and have a blessed day.